And I'm going to introduce Mark. He's a consultant for building physics, sustainable building, and sustainable energy. He has a PhD on straw building, a principal researcher with the Green Energy Project of Saskatchewan, which is building a plan to shift the province
onto sustainable electricity.
Onto sustainable electricity. Yay. And he's a co-founder of the Climate Justice League of Saskatchewan. I just threw the league in. I thought it sounded really kind of comic book like. Okay, so Mark, it's your.
And it'd be great if we can become a league. We need more people.
Yes.
I would love to be a little ray of sunshine tonight after what you've just heard and after what's going on outside, for that matter. But sorry.
We're not there yet.
This is grim. There is hope, but there's only hope if we're prepared to put a lot of work into it. So I'm going to start with the bad news, just as Diane did, and move on to some of the things that we should be doing politically. And I guess I'd like to, emphasize some of the points that Diane made. What you see up here is the cover of a report that came out last year, came from a Spanish NGO. They went to every country in the world. They had a look at what were the impacts of climate change already in that country. And they came up with figures for the number of deaths and for the amount of money that it was costing in adaptation. Now, I'm not going to look at the money, I'm just going to look at the deaths. Up here. Being a cheerful sort of a guy. And I wish I could get this to work.
Abracadabra.
Ah.
There we go.
Oh.
Right.
Okay. So they looked at death from climate and from burning fossil fuels. At the moment, just burning fossil fuels is killing more people. But climate change is already killing 400,000 people a year. And you'll see from those figures that more than half of that is from hunger. That is because we are already seeing droughts. Diane showed you a couple of these maps. I'm going to show you a couple more to show you where the story goes. And if you look at the scale on the bottom, anything to the left, any colour to the left of -4 is worse than the worst droughts in the 30s in the States. This is on it's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is a sort of standard international way of measuring drought. So it's already pretty bad, gets worse in the 2030s. 2060 to 2069, the prediction is, well, you can see, it's moving up into Saskatchewan. Maybe that's when people here will get worried. I hope people will get worried here a long time before that. And this is actually based on a model that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which the increase in emissions is already exceeding. So the chances are this will happen earlier than 2060. So, and then when we go to 2090, basically it's pretty miserable. So there's some more bad news. Okay, so what have our governments decided to do about it? Well, this is what they said at Copenhagen in 2009 at the International Conference. You'll remember that it broke up in some disorder because they couldn't come to a proper agreement, but they did at least say this, that they recognise that we have to keep the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. Those figures I was showing you for 2060, it was assuming a 2.8 degree rise. On the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable development. That's what they agreed. That's what our government agreed. In Cancun in 2010, they reinforced that. They said basically the same thing again. I don't have the words from Durban in 2011, but they basically said it again. And Peter Kent, our so-called environment minister, basically reaffirmed those agreements in 2010. So, what's it mean? Well, I've just put this list of recent papers that show the science of what we need to achieve, just in case anybody wants to get a copy of my notes. They'll then have a copy of those references. But what we've basically come to is that we have a carbon budget. There is so much carbon that we can burn, and then no more, if we're going to stay within that 2-degree limit. And you'll see more about that in the film later. But that limit is set by the laws of physics and chemistry. We can't play politics with it. We can't negotiate with it. It is a limit, and we have to stay within it. And what that really means is that we have to peak our emissions sometime this decade as a global community. That's everybody. Some countries are already decreasing. Other countries, it's rising rapidly because they want to be as rich as we are. But as a global community, we need to return at least to 2005 levels, which was that figure, 45 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year emissions by 2020. And I'll explain the scientific terms if anybody asks afterwards, or if you want to ask for clarification now, you can do that too. But, as I say, the newly industrializing countries, and China and India are always brought up at this point, they're increasing their emissions because they're pulling people out of poverty. They're pulling some of their people out of poverty anyway. So we also have to look at that other clause in Copenhagen on the basis of equity. And they agreed in Cancun that the largest share of historical emissions came from developed countries, countries like Canada. And because of this historical responsibility, we have got to get there first. We've got to make our reductions first and not really expect people in poor countries to make reductions for us. They're already poor enough. So what does the science say? Well, if you have a look at those papers that I listed there, you'll see a number of figures, but this is actually the most hopeful figure I can find. A 25% reduction by 2020 compared to our 1990 figures in industrialized, wealthy Western countries. And that's assuming the most favorable terms possible for us, which actually is probably not fair to the rest of the world. But let's take that figure. And let's see how Canada stands up to it. That's what we emitted in 1990. That's what we emitted in the latest figures that we've published for 2011. We have to submit to the UN our audit of how much we're emitting every year, and it's usually about, 14, 15 months after the year end that it's published. So it has risen. We did not keep our Kyoto promises even before we backed out of Kyoto and officially broke our promises. So on the basis of that Anderson and Boyes and Bose figure, that's what we should be at 2020, 442 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That is what our government has set as a target. They said, we'll go for a 17% reduction compared to 2005. So that's pretty hopeless in itself. But that also has an impact on other countries. At Copenhagen, the European Union countries, 27 developed countries, plus a few other European countries that associate with them in these negotiations, said, okay, we'll go for a 20% cut by 2020, but if other developed countries will improve their targets, we'll go better than that, we'll go to 30%. Australia made a similar type of promise. The trouble is, we didn't improve our promise, the Americans didn't improve their promise, the Japanese didn't improve their promise, and so we're stuck with a poorer promise from the Europeans than we could have had. So we are impacting the world in a negative way. But it's worse than that. Environment Canada put out a report last summer, about a year ago, which, when you've waded through the official political verbiage, what you actually find is that they are predicting that we will hit 745 megatons in 2020. Peter Kent says, we're halfway to our targets. What he means is, well, if we hadn't done any reductions at all, and most of the reductions that have happened through provincial governments, especially Ontario, then we would be somewhere up at 900 or whatever it is. And we're halfway to where we should be, because otherwise we would have been up there. So there's the graph. The science says that we should be doing what that green line says. What the government's promised is the red line. What they're actually doing is the blue line. Why is that? Well, this is a breakdown of where our emissions come from. Now, I've actually extrapolated to 2025 on this, not because I think those are realistic figures, but just so that you can see the trends more clearly. So don't take the 2025 figures seriously. But you'll see there, I don't know how clearly you can read it, but each of those categories of emissions. You've got residential heating, commercial heating, passenger transport, freight transport, other transport, which is mostly pipelines, electricity from coal, you see that's decreasing because Ontario are coming off coal, other electricity, agriculture, light manufacturing and so on, waste, iron and steel and various other industries, coal production is that tiny little blue one, gas production processing, conventional oil production, oil and gas transmission, oil and gas refining and distribution, and at the top, bitumen extraction, including upgrading. Which of those is really increasing? It's the tar sands. Now, we've got to work on the others. We've got to reduce the others. We've got to bring them right down. But that's the one that is really fouling it up. Just so that you can see a breakdown of where our emissions were in 2011, which is another way of looking at sort of where do we really need to take action first. You see electricity is big, the black bit there, transport is big, the sort of mauvey blue one down in the left-hand corner. And there's several other sectors that need to be addressed. So where are these emissions happening?
Oh my God.
Okay, so these are the figures for 1990, 2000, 2005 and 2011. I'd just like to draw your attention to Nunavut, over on the right there. Not only do they have the lowest emissions per capita in Canada, they have been reducing them. I was told by my MP, oh, we can't have really low emissions in Canada because think of all those people in the north. Yukon is actually the third lowest per capita at the moment. It was the lowest per capita in 2010. You'll see most provinces are actually beginning to manage to reduce. Saskatchewan and Alberta are way up there. We're still at nearly 70 tonnes per person per year in this province. That's more than any nation state in the world. It's more than probably 46 of the 50 states in that mammoth thing to the south of us. And that's the history of it in Saskatchewan. 1990, we already knew about climate change. James Hansen made public announcements about it, I think it was 1988, is that right, Diane?
Yes.
It was in the news all over the world. What did we do? We increased our emissions. In 1997, we had all three parties in the legislature saying, no, we don't want to have anything to do with Kyoto. Just to compare, that's what's happened for Canada. If we had kept to our Kyoto promises, those dotted lines, the red and the green, is where we would have got to. Here's a country that did keep its Kyoto promise, Sweden. You see, it's per capita very much lower to start with, managed to consistently reduce it. And as a matter of interest, Sweden has about a bit over 9 million people, 9 times the size of Saskatchewan. They generate less emissions than we do in total. Developed economy, probably a better standard of living than we have. So where are emissions coming from here? Well, you'll see 4 big sectors there. Electricity, because we're so coal-based in this province. Transport, fugitive sources. Now what that means is when oil and gas wells release methane, either deliberately or as a leak, it is not captured. It's just let out into the atmosphere. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Sometimes they will flare it. That burns it to produce carbon dioxide, which is a less potent greenhouse gas, but it's still a greenhouse gas. There are countries which have basically effectively legislated against those practices. You collect the methane and you use it as fuel. If you really must be in the business of collecting oil and gas, just collect a bit more gas to burn instead of just bumming it into the atmosphere. And then the other one is agriculture, which is basically methane from cows and other ruminants, and coming out both ends, and nitrous oxide from decay of fertilizers. And that's something which organic agriculture could do something about. So those are the figures. I'll move on. So, what should we do about this? Well, there's a lot we should do about it. I just want to set some priorities, some political priorities. When the subject of climate change comes up, people very often think, oh, it's an environmental issue, and then think, environmental issue, this is about my personal lifestyle. Okay, yes, it is about your personal lifestyle, but it's also about public policy. So, I want to focus on the political side. Let's get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies that we are giving at the moment out of our tax money. The International Institute for Sustainable Development, based in Winnipeg, did a report in 2010 which they calculated that $1.4 billion goes straight to the oil and gas industry out of federal coffers. And actually another 1.4 billion out of various provincial coffers, including 300 million from Saskatchewan. That's according to the World Trade Organization's definitions of subsidy, which are kind of complex, so I'm not going to go into them here. I wouldn't go into them even if I did understand them. But that's a definition that the government could stick with. I have been trying to get information from my MP about this. I have not been very successful. She is not answering letters when they make points that, she can't do the Train Seal Act on, basically. But But from what she has said, it seems that there has been some legislation which will reduce this, maybe eventually to 1 billion. The IMF this year did a different study of subsidies. They used a different definition. Because every time we chuck carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, or rather every time the fossil fuel industry chucks it into the atmosphere, it is being subsidised because it does not have to pay to use the atmosphere as a waste dump. And that has consequences. We've seen consequences in climate change. There are also consequences from the fossil fuel industry in terms of toxins being thrown into the atmosphere, including carcinogens, which are affecting people in Fort Chip, for example. There are climate impacts, such as we've seen in Diane's long procession of painful slides. People die, but these things also cost money to put right. I know people who are still going to Minot to clear up the mess there. That was 2 years ago. So when the IMF did its study, they found that actually we're subsidising by 26 billion in this province. That's $750 per person throughout Canada. Now, if you add on to that the $300 that we in Saskatchewan are paying per capita into the oil and gas industry, come to around $1,000 that per person in this province. Now, what do you say the GDP was per capita? 80,000? Okay, so that's more than 1% of our money is going straight into the oil and gas industry, well, the fossil fuel industry. Okay, second priority. Limit tar sands extraction. We've just seen on that graph why it's a problem. The way that the federal government can limit tar sands extraction is to refuse permits to new pipelines. And I don't care whether they go to the States or whether they go to BC or whether they go across to the East Coast. Refuse them. Because that enables the industry to take more stuff out of the ground and put more carbon into the atmosphere. The International Energy Agency 450 scenario, that's a scenario that they use to say, this is what we could do to give ourselves a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees C. That scenario, they come to a figure of 3.3 million barrels of oil a day from the tar sands being the maximum that you can manage. Not because of it having a significant proportion of the carbon emissions, but because of the cost of oil more generally. Other oil was going to be cheaper, so if we go more than that, then we're going to be producing more oil from other sources as well, and we just blow the whole thing out. So that's our limit, 3.3. Current production is 2.3. If you add in the facilities that are under construction, it comes to 3. If you add in the facilities which are not yet under construction but which are fully improved, it comes to 5.2. So we are already over that figure. Those corporations in northern Alberta are going to have to take some losses if we are going to survive. And what they want to do is go to 9.4, and that's over a timescale of about a decade. Okay, third thing, eliminate coal-fired power, and do it quickly. Ontario will have done so by the end of this year. That leaves Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia has some, New Brunswick has a little. Somebody with a hand up there.
Does that mean going nuclear?
No. It means going to renewables. And somebody else with a hand up.
I think I heard that they open a new coal-fired plant in China every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It just seems like what we could do here would be over compensated to the bad a lot by
Well,
what's
two
going
things.
on over there.
Let's not sell so much coal to China. Which
they have
it
their-
is being sold to China through
Oh,
Vancouver Port from Alberta. And secondly, we control what we do. We can't necessarily control what they do. And they are not going to get it right unless we get it right. They're waiting for us.
How many coal power plants do we have in Alberta, Saskatchewan?
I don't know the total number. I mean, in Saskatchewan we've got 3 units. I mean, some of those are multiple, you know, yeah. Alberta's got more than we have. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, it's a bit smaller.
Has Ontario done it totally with renewable?
They have shifted to a large extent to renewables. They've also shifted to gas. They've also been doing conservation work, which means that their total consumption is down. Okay. Another priority is work on vehicle efficiency. There are vehicle efficiency rules in the pipeline to come in 2017. They're to harmonise with the US ones which Obama brought in. To my mind, it's too little too late. And we don't just need laws, we need incentives to make people choose the better vehicles, to enable people to choose the better vehicles.
Like some of the subsidies that are going to the big companies should go to people to buy the better
Absolutely.
cars.
Absolutely. And finally, for top priorities, put a price on carbon. And that, to my mind, means a carbon tax. I mean, there's a number of ways that we can approach this. Carbon tax does not have to mean that we do away with income tax on the rich. I think we should keep income tax on the rich. But it does mean that we can take income tax off the poor. And it just seems fair that if people are consuming a product which is ultimately going to cause devastation, then it's only right that they should have to pay for some of the costs of that devastation. The advantage of carbon tax is that you can put it on the corporations which import the fossil fuels and the corporations which mine the fossil fuel, which get them out of the ground. It's simple. You don't have to put it on everybody. And then what you do with that money, there's a lot of things we could talk about there, which I'm not going to now. So there's my priorities. And number 6, don't forget the other sources of greenhouse gases. We've got to work on all of them, but those 5 seem to me to be the priorities. Just for completeness, what can we do at a provincial level? Again, eliminate our fossil fuel subsidies. Again, shift away from coal-fired electricity. We could do it by probably 2030 if we had a thoroughgoing programme to shift to renewables. A thoroughgoing programme to shift to renewables needs first, though, some serious action on conservation and efficiency. SaskPower, if I understand correctly, currently is targeting 0.3% efficiency savings year on year in terms of what we consume. Okay, it's better than 0. California has been achieving 1.4% efficiency savings on average consistently since 1974. We can do a lot better than we are being told that we can.
Is it true that China has instituted a carbon tax based on the evidence that they see?
There was talk of a carbon tax about 2 months ago, and then they said, "Oh, no, we're not going to do a carbon tax. We're going to do cap and trade." And it's not clear where that's got to now. But they're seriously talking about it, and they are talking about capping their consumption sometime in the early 2020s. So I think it's early days as far as China's concerned, but at least they're thinking about things which in many ways they're ahead of us. Okay, thirdly, legislate to outlaw venting and flaring of the methane from oil and gas wells. And again, price and tax carbon. And for completeness, and this kind of leads into some of the things that we'll be hearing in a bit, what can we do at a municipal level? Well, we need to move to a strict building energy code. We are now going to have an energy code at last in this province. But what it will achieve at the outset is very little, because the rules that it's set are really quite lax. And that's been necessary to bring industry in. We need to make it stricter. Diane showed pictures of Freiburg, of Vauban in Freiburg, which is basically a new estate built on it's an old French air base in Western Germany. Every new building that goes up there has to meet Passive House standards. Passive House is a German standard which basically it works out at about 1/10 of the energy consumption that you would get in an R2000 house. So the stuff that is considered efficient here, 1/10 of that consumption. We can't get there overnight, but we should be moving there. Secondly, transport plans. Our planning system here is a mess. If you live in one of the suburbs, it takes you maybe an hour to get somewhere by bus, and you get there in 10 to 15 minutes. Cycling is a little bit easier, but you still have to contend with all the people in trucks. And the state of the roads in the winter. And the state of the roads in the summer, for that matter. So let's have a planning system which puts pedestrians, cyclists and public transit before cars and trucks, and which limits necessary travel distances. So your shops are local. We live in Newtown, we can walk to the shops. Most people in the city can't. Big box stores, meanwhile, are effectively subsidised. They should be having to pay for the privilege of bringing their operation into this city. And thirdly, I hope James is going to have time to talk about this, local wind and solar cooperatives. It's kind of difficult at the moment because of the rules that are set down in law and the approach which SAS Power is taking to that. But I think James can fill us in a little bit more on that, so I'm not going to say any more about that. If we work together, we can achieve these things. Because so many of these things, actually, it's not just good in terms of carbon emissions. It's good in terms of democracy. It's good in terms of people's health. It's good in terms of building a society where people matter. If we put people in control of their own energy systems, isn't that an improvement? I'm going to stop.
All right.